Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. And another news and notes mashup video today. So we'll start with a little bit of news, a few fight announcements like Justis Huni, he's got a fight coming, Vlad Sirenko also, and then rounding out the video with three different post-fight reviews. So just a minute or two on each. You've got Hosea, Stewart, Matty Harris, and also Sergey Kuzmin who've been in action. The former two are debutants who've just had their first pro fight in the United Kingdom. So starting though with Kubrat Pulev, because he could be on the menu for Joyce in 2022. So this week, in the build-up to Kubrat Pulev's fight with Frank Mir, his promoter Ivalo Gotsev of Epic Sports and Entertainment had stated he's definitely looking forward to some good clashes this coming year, 2022. We've been getting a lot of offers. Joyce is looking for us. Kubrat is definitely not a stepping stone for no one, so we're going to pick and choose our battles and get him back to where he feels great. It's all about how he wants to enter the ring and how long he wants to keep going for. And just on the Joyce fight specifically, yes, absolutely, they're reaching out, they're talking to us, but when they get serious, they know who to call. I want to hear from Joyce's promoter, Frank Warren himself. And actually, at this stage of Joyce's career, that's probably, you know, not a bad sort of opponent, not a bad name to get on his resume, given where Kubrat Pulev has been operating at. I guess, like a couple of other guys on his resume, like a Carlos Takam, Kubrat Pulev also past prime, but it would be another resume builder as he sort of works his way to a title shot. Who knows when? But in sometime in the next year or two, it looks like Joyce is going to get a title shot. And a Kubrat Pulev fight, I'd be okay with that. And I think he walks through Pulev, who's past prime, and he would spark out Kubrat Pulev. I know that there are a few hardcore Kubrat Pulev fans who think he's got a lot left. But in my humble opinion, I think he's done. Stick a fork in him. He's done. Joyce would absolutely wreck Kubrat Pulev, would walk him down and stop him, in my view. Someone else who's looking for a stablemate of Joyce's, Tyson Fury, he's been called out by Frank Sanchez. As we know, Frank Sanchez most recently fought on the Wilder Fury undercard. He was facing F.A. Ajagba in that one. Got the win there, it looked very impressive. So he's calling out Tyson Fury via his manager, Mike Burrell. So Burrell telling Sky Sports, Frank Sanchez is one of the most active, high-profile fighters today. Okay, so I'll just jump in there for a minute. So he has been active, but that in part is because he's cheap. He's cheaper than a lot of these other heavyweights in the PBC stable. The more expensive you are, the less you're going to fight when you're with PBC. It just sort of seems to be, especially in the pandemic, a reality. And no offense to Frank Sanchez, but he is not a high-profile fighter at this point. He might be on high-profile cards, but he doesn't have the fans' sort of appeal that to match where he's sort of fighting. He couldn't sort of fill up a phone booth with fans. But Mike Burrell goes on, Frank was the co-main event for Fury Wilder 3. He's featured on Canelo's pay-per-view fights, and he is now co-main event for the Charles Martin vs. Luis Ortiz pay-per-view fight. His rise has been extraordinary, as well as his undeniable talent. And he does have very good talent. But the fact he continues to be co-main events probably actually more sort of leads into that he doesn't have enough star power on his own to headline a card. Otherwise, they'd be putting him up to headline a card. I mean, if you can get Michael Polite Coffee being the main event versus Johnny Rice, well, why can't Frank Sanchez headline his own card on PBC if they believe in him that much? It's a question. So he says, Mike Burrell continues, I think Frank Sanchez beats Tyson Fury today. Tyson's no fool, so I doubt you see a voluntary defense against Frank Sanchez anytime soon. He will have to force the issue by beating guys like F.A. Ajagba and work towards the mandatory. At Frank's current pace, I have no doubt he will become #1 contender in short order. The day Frank Sanchez gets the opportunity and fights for a world title is the day he becomes heavyweight champion. Well, I guess, it's kind of joined the queue, all in good time with the sort of logjam in the heavyweight division. And Frank Sanchez doesn't really bring a lot of name value, doesn't really sell a lot of tickets, doesn't bring a lot of fans with him. So there is other reasons besides him being a dangerous fighter for promoters to sort of look the other way, because he's not a draw. That actually does matter in the heavyweight division to some extent. But if he does get a title shot, and who knows when that would be. At this current rate, you're sort of looking 2 to 3, 4 years away. He probably would be in with a good shot. But a lot of the guys who are at the top now may not be there in 3 or 4 years' time. It's just a reality and the renewal process in the heavyweight division. But Frank Sanchez, undeniably, he is a talented fighter. But ultimately, at the moment, and you can think of some other guys as well, he's not a draw. And that kind of hurts him to some extent, because he won't get the push, he won't headline cards, he won't become a huge name in his own right. And that hurts him. Moving on to sort of the fight announcement side of the video here, we've got a couple of fight announcements. So you've got Justis Hooney versus Joseph Goodall. So Hooney, the Australian heavyweight champion, 5-0. Joseph Goodall, 7-0 and the 1 draw on the resume. So Justis Hooney, he was meant to go to the Tokyo Olympics, but he got injured, so they had quite a heavy schedule for him in the run-up to what would have been an Olympic debut for him. He was a favourite for a medal at the Tokyo Games, but they just pushed him too hard for too long for pay-per-view money, for good money, and ultimately he hurt his hands and re-aggravated the injuries along the way. Had to be pulled out from the Games, has been rehabbing. There was actually talk for a time that Junior Farr was going to be his next fight. And actually Junior Farr on his own YouTube channel had said that basically they'd reached a deal, but it had sort of gone quiet and he didn't really know what was happening. And that was, 2 or 3 weeks ago at the time of recording this video. So clearly not going to be Junior Farr. And I guess for 2 reasons that might be good. They're probably paying Joseph Goodall less, but also Junior Farr, probably a tougher proposition at this stage of his career than Joseph Goodall. If you've followed Goodall to any real extent, he was an okay amateur. He did well, obviously, the amateur level, Commonwealth Games, medaled there, but hasn't really fired as a pro. That 1 draw, probably lucky to get that decision, but he has been working in more recent times with Kevin Barry for about the past, at least it must be about 6 months or so, possibly a little longer. So left Australia, has gone to the US, training and living there, training with Kevin Barry, sparring, and you can see here with the likes of Jared Anderson. So I'm sure that's all been beneficial. But from what I've seen of both these guys, and obviously Goodall, how much he's improved, unclear, but based off previous fights and form and skill, Justis Hooney should have this all day and twice on Sundays. So I think this is more of an appropriate sort of comeback fight, as it were, from injury for Justis Hooney. I think this is a case that he's got another few months to prepare. He doesn't have to think about the Olympics. He doesn't have to think about pay-per-views for huge money against Paul Gallen, all that sort of stuff. He can just start to track that pay-per-view, that sort of that early pro part of his career. It's almost like he's not starting from scratch, but just sort of resetting here, because I think they do need to be careful. They don't need to rush things. Hooney's in his early 20s, clearly got a lot of speed, talent, and skill. They don't need to push him too fast, too far, and wreck him, especially, the red flag with the hand injury. That's, this early stage of his career is just something to watch out for. But I think Goodall will be a guy who can go some rounds with Hooney, well, hopefully. But I think Justis Hooney will be too good for him, possibly even stop him. But yeah, I don't mind this, and it'll be interesting to see with Goodall under the tutelage of Kevin Barry, how far has he come? Is he going to be a guy that can actually sort of, establish a true level in the heavyweight division? Because at the moment, he's kind of been a bit of a forgotten man. Okay, so moving on, Vladislav Sirenko has been confirmed to face Mikhail Valish, and that will be the 18th of December. So Valish, the German heavyweight, who effectively the past couple of years has been selling his record all around town, for paydays. He has a bloated record. He turns up for 2 or 3 rounds, gives it a bit of a go, ultimately wilts pretty limply in the end. So the first round or 2, he will sort of let his hands go to some extent, show some ability, earn the payday to some extent, and then basically he'll fold. So I expect this is going to continue here. We've seen it in a number of fights in Valish's recent memory against Tony Yoka. You've also had Joyce. There have been others. So what we're going to see now is Vladislav Sirenko probably drop him, hurt him with a left hook, or maybe a straight right. I would expect Sirenko's going to stop him inside 4 rounds. If it goes any further than that, it'll get me sort of doing the side eye at Sirenko. But it is one of these sort of cases that Vladislav Sirenko has been needing step-up fights. Does this really qualify? I'm not so sure, because even though he's had a couple of journeyman level fights in the last year or so, one of 2 of them, they were actually quite tough, durable guys. So perhaps better for the rounds in those sorts of fights, whereas this fight with Valish, he might have a sort of more name recognition, but actually he's just not very good. Anyway, he will get the win there. So moving on, Sergey Kuzmin. So what do we say about this? So he has fought Igor de Silva. He was an unbeaten fighter from Brazil. This was a main event in Russia, and it ended impressively, but it was the 10th round, but it just wasn't much of a fight for most of it. You had some action in round 6 where Igor de Silva got dropped. Then you had de Silva sort of battling back in round 7 and actually giving Sergey Kuzmin some fits. You know, it sort of buckled him a little bit with the right hand, followed up with a beautiful uppercut, and he had Kuzmin sort of on the hop just momentarily. But ultimately, that action was sprinkled between just a lot of dross. Wasn't a fun fight, especially for the first about 5 rounds or so. Pretty dire stuff. You've got Sergey Kuzmin, who for me, again, just confirmed he is not going to be contending at world level. Somewhere 30 to 40 in my view, in terms of the world. But just with there's no dynamism with his style, the way that he fights. And he has to have a certain fighter in front of him to look good. If you put anyone who is moving a little bit and that can actually sort of stay at range and basically just pick him off with jabs, use movement to sort of in and out, he can't handle that. We've seen that before with Michael Hunter, and there were sort of stretches of it here with Igor de Silva, who was largely for a decent chunk of the fight able to stay out of harm's way and even sort of use some nice counters. But de Silva, I don't know why he was doing this, but he would just sort of circle around and then he'd go, okay, I'm ready for a bit of a break. I'm just going to lay on the ropes here. And it was bizarre. He would just take a rest on the ropes, pretend he was Ali, sort of trying to rope a dope and, effectively just taking a break, but often taking shots to the body and cuffing shots, around the head, shoulders sort of area. But ultimately, it wasn't a great fight. Kuzmin did drop him in the 6th round. As I say, it sort of broke into a bit of a fight in the 6th and 7th round. And then there was a massive telegraphed right hand near the end of the 10th round. And de Silva got up and then he sort of sunk to a knee. And then at 9, the referee sort of just waved it off, even though de Silva was on his feet. It was going to be a clear decision if it had continued to Kuzmin. De Silva was game in spots, just didn't throw enough punches. It felt like a bad sparring session at some point that, Kuzmin was just literally plodding forward, occasionally letting his hands go. But he just wasn't accurate enough. He didn't seem to really, try to break him down systematically. He had the opportunity to do so. A little bit guilty of headhunting. I don't know, just wasn't impressive. So for me, Sergey Kuzmin confirms himself as a gatekeeper. He's not challenging anything for a world title anytime soon. So we've got a couple of UK prospects. There was a fight card that was on at York Hall in the United Kingdom, the development series card, which was run by Wasserman Boxing, which is formerly Sauerland, which was bought out by Wasserman. So they're working with Sky and Boxer and all this sort of stuff. But this card, this development series one, it was on Fight TV and also Boxing Social in the United Kingdom. So I don't know if the replay is available. But in terms of the 2 heavyweight fights, and one of the guys, Hosea Stewart, we'll start there first. So I've kept my eye on him for a couple of years since he was sparring with Anthony Joshua. He was part of Team GB, so he was sort of Johnny on the spot up there in Sheffield, getting a few rounds and all that sort of stuff. But anyway, for this fight, weighed in 345 pounds. red flag. Massive red flag. So, I mean, from the sort of, and you can see here, just a substantial human being. And overall, he carries the weight really well, but that's too heavy. So what is he, 6'4", 6'5", somewhere there or thereabouts, 345. I mean, he basically said, you know, Jarrell Miller, hold my beer, because 345 pounds, he was like, you ain't got nothing on me, Mr. Miller. But in terms of Stewart, so one, this is a red flag. After the fight, he actually there were some excuses. He said that he hadn't had good preparation. There'd been some issues with his hand, injury, that sort of stuff. But no point sort of saying that after the fight, you know, if there were issues with the camp and how everything was going, just pull out. You know, it sounds ridiculous to sort of say, oh yeah, I was about 50 pounds overweight because of this one thing. Well, if you weren't fit or, you know, able to train properly, surely that's a recipe for disaster. Maybe not so much in this case, because the fight that he had, it was a guy against an Estonian guy, was it Metsis? This was actually a far more competitive fight than I was expecting, especially for a first pro fight. But I don't think Hosea Stewart made it easy for himself because he was so heavy. Sure, he moved well for a guy at 345 pounds. He was actually relatively, you know, for that size, you know, moving well, better than I was sort of expecting. But the extra weight was slowing him down. Slow feet, slow hands. He wasn't necessarily a plotter, but, you know, there was no defense as well. So you had a combination of all these things against a guy who is actually, even though he was, what, 40, 41, this Estonian guy at Metsis, he was game. He was actually in this fight, you know, trying to give Hosea Stewart some valuable work, and he was letting his hands go. And he was clipping Stewart a lot. Literally, when I say there was no defense, I mean, maybe there was one or two times he slipped punches, but for the most part, he was eating punches like Tic Tacs. And I was just thinking, well, what's the strategy here? Because the jab, it sort of fell away at times. He didn't really seem to be sort of setting up punches and combinations. It was a lot of one-off stuff. Sure, he's got heavy hands, but he didn't really sort of seem to be that effective in placing his punches, wasn't that accurate. A lot of sort of clubbing, cuffing sort of shots, but not a lot of well sort of factor with the debut overall. But, you know, you also have to view this fight in the context that it's his first fight. It was not necessarily the softest of lobs that he could have got, but in the same breath, didn't overly impress. But I think there's certainly some tools to work with, but you can't have, and I remember Patrick Mailata, the New Zealand heavyweight, he sort of did this after his first pro fight, you know, basically made an excuse about the weight. If you're going to be plying your trade as a professional heavyweight boxer, coming in for your first pro fight way overweight and then making an excuse after the fight, just not a good look. So he said after the fight in a post, and here it is here on screen, professional debut, 1-0. I've made it clear how I feel about the performance, but I've got the W and the journey begun onto the next one. We straight back to work, looking forward. Love to everyone for the support. It's been overwhelming how much people are rooting for me. It's going to be a special journey, and I look forward to experiencing with you all. So Hosea Stewart there after his win over Metsis. So not the greatest performance in the world, but in the context that it was probably an opponent some guys, you know, maybe 10, 12, 13-0 may face. It was that sort of level of sort of toughness, and there was more than just to sort of put the high guard up and sort of take punishment. Metsis was actually looking for Stewart and finding him. So, yeah, in that context, and it's his first fight, you know, I can give him a pass on that. Clearly raw, he's going to be developed, and this is what these early fights are for. But on the other hand, 345 on the scale, that really is a massive red flag. Already making excuses about that. No point saying you're going to be 40 or 50 pounds lighter. We've got to see it. Come in at 300 pounds, and then we'll sort of have an assessment about where things are at and what that shedding that rubble actually does for your performance. So I don't want to go sort of too into it, but yeah, it was sort of a mixed bag with that performance. So too for Matty Harris. So he's a big unit, 6'8". He was facing Mladen Marnev, and actually we've got a couple of recent sort of opponents where Marnev has faced, we can get a little bit of a gauge. So David Adelai took out Marnev in a few rounds. You had Solomon Dakers going the distance over 4 rounds. But Marnev, if you haven't seen this fight, or if you haven't seen him before, effectively does what you would expect of a journeyman who's looking to survive. Basically puts the earmuffs on, very negative, very defensive. He will throw a couple of attacks per round just to, you know, remind us that he's actually here to fight and that he's here to do something, earn the paycheck. So Harris, I thought he looked okay, but in the same vein, there seemed to be, with the way that he was fighting here, a lot of wasted effort. Like, he was just sort of popping the jab out, but it was not so much a rangefinder. It was just filling time and filling the space, and he didn't really seem to be throwing to land it most of the time, if you can sort of see what I mean. It sort of seemed when he wanted to have a bit of a break, or just, you know, maybe reset up and, you know, go for another attack, he'd just sort of, for 10 or 15 seconds sometimes, not really do too much, just throw the odd jab out there. And I sort of thought against opponents with more experience, more ability, more ambition, that he's not going to get away with that. So it kind of looked like he was active, but in reality, he was only fighting in small bursts. But when he did sort of put his hands together, his shots together, he did actually look decent. Obviously, early 20s, 6'8", you can't teach height. He seems to have good skills, moves well. You know, he's got some good ingredients to move forward with. So we could actually see something from him in later years, and obviously pretty good condition compared to at least Hosea Stewart, I should say. But yeah, Marnev and I guess Metzes, completely polar opposites in terms of the sorts of opponents. So I guess it was easier for Harris to look good against Marnev because he was just so negative and allowing Harris to do whatever he wanted. Whereas you had Metzes was actually letting his hands go and trying to, you know, have a real good go at Hosea Stewart. And both these fights, they went to decision. What did you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.